Okay, we're ready for the letter J. And if you've seen me already do the letter I, then there's some similarities here. The top curve in the J hugs the body of the letter kind of close. It doesn't extend as far off to the left as many of the other letters do. There's less distance between the curve and the stem of the letter. If you look at your guide sheet there, you'll see what I'm talking about. The biggest difference between the capital J and the capital I is that the J extends beneath the baseline and the curve kicks out a little further than the I does. Now let me go ahead and draw a letter I right here beside it so that you'll see the difference. The differences are somewhat subtle. The I stops at the baseline and the curve, the kick-out curve, foot at the bottom, isn't quite as dramatic. Now, a lot of the recognition between these two letters has to do with context. For instance, if I were to put the letters U-S-T next to that I, your brain would say, that's a J, and you read it as just. Do you understand? So context has a lot to do with distinguishing between these two letters that are so similar. But again, the difference between the distinctives, that is, of the J is the curve is close to the stem, hugs the body of the letter J, and the vertical stem extends below the baseline. And thirdly, this curve kicks out a little bit further. Got it? Let's go ahead and move to the felt tip pen, the letter J. Starting, again, I shift the angle of my pen just a little bit to the 4 position. I'm assuming you saw that in the introductory video, so that you know what I mean by that. The curve here, though, is a little bit shorter. It does not do this like many of the other letters do. Do you see the length of that? Here it's very short. And then the vertical stem comes straight down from there to below the baseline and curves out further than that curve. In other words, this curve is further to the left than this curve. Does that make sense? Let me draw that again without messing it all up. Top curve, stem, below the baseline, bottom curve comes out further to the left. Now, let's talk about the lowercase j. Likewise is very similar to the lowercase I. The difference being the J, of course, extends below the baseline, and the curve, the kick-out curve at the bottom, is just a little bit longer than the I. Just to make it clear, here's the letter I, and here's the letter J. Got it? But they both have a dot, so they look quite a bit like each other. Now, what if the letter J, the lowercase j, has to connect to the next letter? The answer is pretty much it doesn't. Now, depending on the context, depending on the verbiage and how your words look, sure, you might sometime sort of add an additional connector, but most of the time you wouldn't. Most of the time. So that's a case-by-case example. What if the letter J is the last letter in a line of type? Again, normally I wouldn't do anything to the letter J. You could play around with it. You could say, well, what happens if I do something like that? As long as it doesn't start looking like a Y, that's perfectly legal. So those flourishes at the end of the line of type are very optional, and you can do a number of different things to make it work. Now let's go to the big bad boy of the calligraphy world, the dip pen. This is also the one that gets your fingers dirty. Do you understand it? So if your fingers are getting dirty, don't think you're doing something wrong. That's just the way it goes. Piece of paper up here to make sure my pen is behaving. Let's do now a capital letter J. Making the curve, hugs the body of the letter just a little bit more, below the baseline, and kick out. You notice on that kick out curve, I pushed the pen, right? Which, technically speaking, you shouldn't push, you should always pull. But maybe you've heard me say already, technical is one thing, actual is another. It depends on the pen that you're using and the paper that you're working on. If you can't push the pen, then you do that in 2 parts. You get it? So here I'm pulling the curve and making sure they meet up there. Either one is perfectly appropriate. You can cheat and push if you can get away with it. If I can't tell you did it, if we can't tell you did it, that's perfectly fine. Lowercase j, you know how this goes. Nice stem below the baseline and a little bit of a longer kick out curve at the bottom than we had on the letter I. Good enough. You have got the J down. You're doing great. Let's keep going.